Alright, now we're gonna go to the chapter 4. Alright, so chapter 4, Nikolai. Despite Zoya's protests, Nikolai had refused to remain in Yvette's. The beginnings of a plan had formed in his mind, and he didn't want to waste another day languishing at a trade summit. He wasn't interested in Hiram Schneck or his marriageable daughters, and the next time Nikolai conversed with a member of the Kirch Merchant Council, it would be on his own terms. To that end, though he had plenty of business awaiting him in the capital, his first stop had to be at the Count Kitigin's. He needed to collect a bit of information along with his most valued fabricator, and as a rule, if one had the opportunity to visit a pleasure palace, one should, especially if said pleasure palace served as cover for a secret laboratory. The elder Count Kitigin was a West Afghan merchant who had made vast sums of money trading arms and intelligence and anything else that wasn't nailed down to Ravka's enemies. But his son had served with Nikolai in Helmhand, and in exchange for getting to keep his considerable fortune as well as avoiding the disgrace of being stripped off his title and seeing his father thrown in jail forever for treason, the younger Kitigin had pledged both money and fealty to the crown, a more than reasonable bargain. Nikolai's demands had been unorthodox. Kitigin was already a bit of a rake. Now he was to live decadently, spend wildly, and maintain a reputation as a notorious libertine and social climber. The young count had taken to the role with zeal, staging elaborate parties renowned for their debauchery and doing his best to buy his way into the homes of Ravkan nobles who possessed more illustrious titles and older, if less plentiful fortunes. He dressed absurdly, drank excessively, and dithered about with such stupid good cheer that his name had become synonymous with both wealth and buffoonery. Oh, the Gritsky's son is a Terran and likely to make much of himself, but at least he's not a Kitigin. This was why, when Kitigin bought a vast swath of land just east of Os Alta, no one blinked. Of course, Kitigin wants to be close to the capital. They whispered in sitting rooms and salons, trying to curry favor with the king and the old families, no doubt. But what man of sense and breeding would ever let his daughter near that upstart? And when Kitigin commissioned some Semini mastermind to design a pleasure compound for him like none ever seen on Ravkan soil, complete with earthworks that required the hiring of thousands of men to dig a valley where there had been none before, a wine cellar set to stretch for a mile underground in a vast lake that required Grisha tide makers to fill it and took days to cross by boat. Well, no one batted an eye. They shook their heads when Kitigin took up hot air ballooning and laughed behind their hands when the meadows where he launched excursions were so frequently plagued by fog. Wasteful, grotesque, obscene, they chorused, and all hoped for invitations to one of Kitigin's spectacular feats. Kitigin dubbed his magnificent compound Las Lion, the Gilded Hollow, though it was so often cloaked in mists and damp that it was usually referred to as the Gilded Bog, and the parties he threw were indeed legendary, but they were also part of a grand lie, a lie essential to Ravka's future. As it turned out, Kitigin's wine cellar ran for 5 miles, not one, and it was not a wine cellar at all, but an underground bunker devoted to weapons development. The lake was used for prototypes of undersea craft and Nikolai's new naval warfare ventures. The dense fog shrouded the valley was frequently helped along by Grisha squallers to provide cover from prying eyes and Fierdan air surveillance. The ballooning meadow was in fact an airfield. The elaborate gardens hid 2 long straight runways for testing experimental aircraft, and the frequent fireworks Kitigin staged disguised the sound of rifle fire and shelling. There was of course no mysterious Zemini architect. Nikolai had designed the Gilded Bog himself. Though young Count Kitigin's fortune had paid for its construction, the king visited occasionally as a party guest, to ride or hunt or drink Kitigin's excellent wines, but more often he arrived in secret through one of his own private entrances and went immediately to see to the progress of his latest endeavor. Nikolai always felt a sense of excitement as he entered the Gilded Bog. The palace at Os Alta was full of ghosts. His father's crimes, his mother's failings, the memory of his brother's body bleeding on the floor as a darkling shadow soldier smashed through the windows of the eagle's nest. But Leigh Lion was Nikolai's creation. Here, for a short time, the demon that ruled his nights and troubled his dreams retreated. Held at bay by logic, the hope of progress, and the happy pastime of building giant things meant to explode. But the Gilded Bog was not only a playground for his inventions, it was also where the strengths of the First and Second Armies of traditional weaponry and Grisha power would be forged into something new. Hopefully, thought Nikolai as he and Talia reached for the front steps of the main house, or it's where I'll spend the last of Ravka's war's chest and have nothing to show for it but a pile of rusty propellers and a chilly lake that makes for mediocre sailing. Ravka was many things to him. A grand lady who required constant courting, a stubborn child unwilling to stand on its own, and most often, a drowning man. The more Nikolai struggled to save it, the harder it fought, but with the help of the scientists and soldiers of the Gilded Bog, he might just drag his country to shore yet. Your Highness, Kirikin said as he swept down the stairs to greet Nikolai. His orange hair had been arranged in a sleek coiffure, and he was turned out in a violet coat and gold brocade wholly inappropriate to the hour. Beside Talia dressed in stolid olive drab and mounted on his towering stock horse, Kirikin looked like an actor in the wrong play. How can I be expected to prepare the best entertainments when you give me no notice of your arrival? Ah, Kirikin, said Nikolai, ignoring the formality of the count's bow to embrace him and slap him on the back. I know you like to improvise. A visit to the wine cellar is the perfect place to start. Do come inside. Talia and I would prefer to have ride around your grounds. Will you be stocking game for the season? Of course, Your Highness. We must have sport to keep us warm this winter, and if not, the 300 bottles of Kirch brandy I've laid my hands on should do the trick. For saint's sake, Nikolai sometimes worried that Kirikin had taken to his role as a reprobate with a little too much enthusiasm. Just don't get the entirety of my cabinet soused, he said. I need a few coherent ministers in hand. Of course, said Kirikin, peering down the drive, the hope clear on his face. Poor fool. Zoya has gone directly to the capital. Kirikin cleared his throat. It's of no matter to time. I just wondered if I should have the cordial she likes waiting. Is Commander Nazyalensky well? Pretty as a picture and brimming with spite. She's lovely, isn't she? Said Kirikin dreamily. I'll leave you to it then, and if you would, send her my regards. All saints, rumbled Talia, should have you for breakfast. The Count grinned. Might not be such a bad way to go, eh? Kirikin, old friend, said Nikolai. You're a good fellow. Why not find yourself a nice girl who likes hunting and can feel warmly toward the wastrel? Kirikin shuffled his feet like a schoolboy. I just can't help but feel that Commander Nazyalensky's ice demeanor masks a tender spirit. Talia snorted. She'll pop your heart and drink it. Kirikin looks aghast, but Nikolai suspected Talia was right. He'd come to recognize the bizarre phenomena of Zoya's beauty the way men love to create stories around it. They said she was cruel because she'd been harmed in the past. They claimed she was cold because she just hadn't met the right fellow to warm her. Anything to soften her edges and sweeten her disposition. And what was the fun in that? Zoya's company was like strong drink, bracing and best abstain if you could handle the kick. Nikolai hoisted himself back into the saddle. Commander Nazyalensky's eyes exterior masks an even interior, but I will most certainly let her know you wish her health. He nudged his horse into a trot and Talia followed suit. They made their way along the white gravel path that ran parallel to the eastern side of the main house. Through the windows, Nikolai heard music from the parlors and gaming rooms. He glimpsed bodies swathed in silk and jewels and saw a man wearing nothing but an admiral's hat and beating a large pot with a spoon as he ran down the hall. Talia's skull was deep enough to sow seeds in. The crown shouldn't be associated with such displays. Perhaps not, conceded Nikolai, but the Ravkan people like their leaders with just a touch of the seemly about them. They don't trust a man of too much virtue. Nolia narrowed his golden eyes. And you really trust a man of so little? I know you don't approve, but Kirikin has played the part I've asked him to. He might not be the brightest fellow, but he's loyal. You can't possibly think Zoya would spare him her time. Inspiration never does. Poor Kirikin would be better off trying to waltz with a bear. Even so, Nikolai thought neither Zoya nor Talia gave the young count enough credit. Kirikin's affability and lack of ambition hid a good heart. He was an honorable man with romantic ideas of duty to his country and profound shame over the way his father had conducted himself, something with which Nikolai could sympathize. Nikolai was acutely aware of his own father's reputation. It was one of the many reasons he kept his public visits to Laslayan to a minimum. From the moment he contemplated taking the throne, Nikolai had known he would have to be a better man than his father and a better king than his brother could have ever hoped to be. Vasily had been killed by the Darkling, and Nikolai had done his best to grieve for him. But the truth was that his brother's untimely death had proved quite timely indeed. Nikolai was pleased to see two groundskeepers emerge from the hedges as soon as he and Talia left the gravel path. Kirigin's entire staff, from scullery maid to groom to head housekeeper, was made up of the king's spies. Any falcons in disguise? Nikolai called, using the code that would allow them to pass without triggering security protocols. No, but we hear there are foxes in the woods, one of the men replied, and they returned to their work. The codes changed each week and were just one of the ways they could keep the real business of the Gilded Bog secure. The southern shore of the lake was heavy with unnatural mist, and only when he and Talia had passed through the haze did they see the docks bustling with both Grisha and First Army engineers. The waters were arrayed with the latest prototypes of Nikolai's hydrofoil fleet. The real fleet would be constructed at Hedon Base on Ravka's coast. Small gunners and new transportation ships that could carry everything from troops to aircraft. Assuming Nikolai could somehow find the money to finance the project, not even Kirigin was rich enough to modernize an entire navy. Nikolai would have liked to stay and watch the test, but he had other priorities today. He and Tolyard tethered their horse by one of the moss-covered grottos that entered the caves. The air should have been moist, but the grotto was not a real one, and the humidity in the labs and the passageways inside was strictly regulated by squallers. Nikolai found the appropriate notch in the stone by a cluster of fake salt lilies and punched his thumb into the divot. The stone shifted, revealing a brass chamber. He pulled a lever, the door clunked shut, and he and Tolya were descending, down, 6 stories into the earth to Kirigin's infamous wine cellar. It could be reached from hidden elevators located throughout the property. I hate this part, muttered Tolya. Feels like being buried. Nikolai knew Tolya had always been killed in a cave during his time with the Sun Summoner. Ooh, you should wait above, watch them test the new engines. I could use a report on their success. He tightened the knot that restrained his long black hair and folded his huge tattooed arms. Tamar says fears are like weeds. They grow wild if left unattended. Well, and good for Tamar. Tolya's twin was essentially fearless, so forcing herself underground is a bit of a light gardening. Tolya gritted his teeth. If I don't face it, I'll never get over it. Nikolai chose to hold his tongue. If the sweat on Tolya's massive brow and his clenched jaw were any indication, his exertions beneath the earth were doing him no good at all. But the war had left all of them with wounds, and Tolya had the right to tend to his as he saw fit. Nikolai flexed his fingers in his gloves and thought of the black scars staining his fingers. Would I have the courage to look the monster in the eye? He truly didn't know. When the doors to the elevator opened, they exited to another brass chamber, their passage blocked by a thick steel door. Nikolai set to opening the scalar combination locks he'd learned about from a certain master thief in Ketterdam. A moment later, the door swung open and he was home. The laboratories were separated into 4 main divisions, though all of them worked together as needed. Artillery and body armor, naval warfare, aerial warfare, and the labs devoted to trying to develop both an antidote to Jordaparem and a strain of the drug that might allow Grisha to heighten their powers without making them addicts. His first stop was always the labs. He spoke briefly to his alchemy to confirm what he'd suspected regarding the antidote based on their last report, and collected a tiny vial of the stuff to share with the triumvirate. Nikolai wanted something concrete to dangle before his advisors, given what he intended to propose. It took them a little longer to find David Kostic, since the fabricator worked in every division of the laboratory. But eventually, they discovered him hunched over a set of blueprints by the vast tanks where the latest prototypes of their new submersibles were being built in miniature. The sleeves of his purple fabricator's kefta were threadbare, and his pearly-cut brown hair gave him the appearance of a shaggy dog deep in thought. Through the glass, Nikolai saw the most recent version of his Ismarsha, his underwater fleet. On land, they looked clumsy, wide, flat, and ungainly, like someone had taken a quality piece of metal and pounded it into a winged pancake. But beneath the surface, they became something elegant. Sinuous predators that glided through the depths, their movements guided by tide makers, their crews provided with breathable air through a combination of squalor power and a filter that had taken Nikolai and David the better part of a year to perfect. The real challenge would be arming the fleet. Only then would his ships become a true school of sharks. After that, it wouldn't matter how many warships Ravka's enemies built. His Marshal would be able to move through the world's ocean unseen and attack without ever surfacing. They would change the face of naval warfare. David looked up from where he was consulting with Nadia Zabin over the pendulum and valve system they were developing for missile targeting. They're testing the surface engines today, he said. And good morning to you, David. Is it morning? The sunrise was my first indication, said Nikolai. How did the new missiles look? "We're still trying to get them to maintain course," said Nadia, her pale pointed features tinged blue from the light reflecting off the tank. She was a squaller who had fought beside the Sun Summoner with her younger brother, Adric, but she'd shown her true potential in weapons design. She'd been integral in the development of the Ismartia. "I think we're close." Though the inventor Nikolai thrilled at the news, his enthusiasm was tempered by the conversation he'd had with Hiram Schneck back in Yvette's. He could practically feel the courage breathing down his neck, and it wasn't a sensation he relished. Nikolai had two rules for his Nolniki: the scientists and soldiers who labored at the Gilded Bog, his Zeros who were neither, for Snorre's second army but both. Above all else, be thieves. Take the work of their enemies and turn it against them. It didn't matter if Ravka got to the technology first, as long as they found ways to make it better. The Fjordans had developed an engine to drive wagons and armored tank battalions, so the Ravgans had made it too powerful enough to move massive ships. The Fjordans had built steel aircraft that didn't require squaller skill to pilot, so Ravka's fabricators stole the design and constructed sleeker flyers and safer, lighter aluminum. The second rule: be fast. Fjerda had made huge leaps in military technology over the last year. How he did not yet know, and Ravka had to find a way to keep pace. Nikolai tapped the blueprints on the table. "If the fuel tests for the surface engines go well, how long until these Marsias are operational?" "A matter of weeks," said Nadia. "Excellent. But we can't put anything into production without more steel. And you'll have it," Nikolai promised. He could only hope he was telling the truth. "Thank you, Your Highness," Nadia said with a smile and a bow. Somehow, she still had faith in her king. But Nikolai wasn't sure if he found her ready confidence reassuring or worrisome. He had always found a way to keep the rusty, ramshackle machine that was Ravka grinding along by finding that extra bit of money when they needed it most, making the right alliance at the right time, cobbling together some invention that would make their meager standing army a match for the vast forces commanded by the enemies at their borders. For Nikolai, a problem had always presented an opportunity no different than the one offered by a Fjerdan engine. He stripped it down into its parts, figured out what drove it, then used those pieces to build something that worked for you instead of against you. The demon disagreed. The demon wasn't interested in problem solving or statecraft or the future. It was nothing but hunger, the need of the moment, what could be killed and consumed. "I'll find a way." All his life, Nikolai had believed that. His will had been enough to shape not only his fate, but his own identity. He had chosen what he had wanted people to see: the obedient son, the feckless rogue, the able soldier, the confident politician. The monster threatened all of that, and they were no closer to finding a way to drive the thing out than they had been 6 months ago. What was there to do but keep moving? Lesser animals whined and struggled when they'd been caught in a snare. The fox found a way out. "David, did you sleep here last night?" Nikolai asked. The fabricator frowned. "I don't think so. He spent the night here," Nadia clarified. "He didn't actually sleep." "Did you?" asked Nikolai. "I dozed off for a bit," Nadia replied evasively. "I'm taking you home to Tamar." "But I need her for the fuel test," David objected. "And I'm taking you home to Genya," added Nikolai. "But don't argue, David. Makes me want to blow something up to assert my authority. I need a triumvirate together, and I'm going to need you and Nadia to start work on a new prototype of the Ismarsia." Nadia brushed her blonde hair from her eyes. "I can start now, Your Highness. Don't go running off to display your excessive competence just yet. I want you to make sure this particular prototype doesn't work." David began rolling up his blueprints carefully, arranging his pens and instruments. "I don't like it when it doesn't make sense." Nadia raised her brows. "I assume Your Highness has a reason?" "I always do." He would drag the drowning man to shore, kicking and screaming if he had to, no matter what the demon demanded. "I'm going to stage a little play," said Nikolai, already imagining a moonlit lake and all the glorious chaos he intended to incite there. "That means I need the right props." This guy is so cool. Chapter 5. Nina. Gaffel. The closer they drew to the town, the harder it was to ignore the rustling whispers in her head. Sometimes Nina could swear she heard voices, the dim shapes of the words just beyond understanding. Other times the sound dwindled to the rush of wind through reeds. "Tell them, my love." But what was there to tell? The sound might be nothing. It might be an auditory hallucination, some remnant of her bout with Param. Or it might be the dead drawing her on. The town itself was located in the shadow of a low mountain range, beneath the hulking shape of what had once been a fort and then a munitions factory lodged into the cliffside high above it. It didn't take long to realize that the old factory had been recommissioned for something new. The traffic of wagons and men traveling in and out of the facility made it clear. But for what? There were no proper inns, only a public house with 2 guest rooms that were already occupied. The owner told them that the convent up the hill sometimes boarded lodgers. Ladies at the convent there take in washing for the soldiers, he said. They don't mind having a few extra hands around for chores. Must be busy these days with the old factory running, said Nina in Ferdan. Good for business. The owner shook his head. Soldiers came in about a year ago, didn't hire any locals. Poured their filth into the river. You don't know that, said a heavy-set woman shelling peas at the bar. The river was full of runoff from the mines before the soldiers started up the smokestacks again. She got a long glance at Nina and the others. Don't pay to speak trouble to strangers. They took the hint and headed out to the main street. It was a surprisingly pretty town, the buildings small and snug, their roofs peaked, their doors brightly painted in yellow, pink, and blue. Leonie gazed up the mountain to where the old factory loomed, its big square buildings pocked with dark windows. They could just be manufacturing rifles or ammunition. Adric's expression was bleaker than usual, or some of those new armored tanks they're so fond of. If that's the case, we'll have some intelligence to pass along to the capital. Nina said she'd hoped that wouldn't be all. Nina was surprised to glimpse signs of the saints here, in places she knew were not dedicated to the Ringsa network. She had seen them on the road too. Altars bearing the symbol of Sancta Alina instead of Gel's sacred ash tree, an icon of Sankt Damian of the Rhine perched in the shop window. 2 thorny bows crossed above a door to signify the blessing of Sankt Felix. There had been talk of miracles and strange happenings throughout Ravka, and it seemed new fervor for the saints that had taken hold in Ferda as well. It was risky to be so public about heresy with soldiers close by, but perhaps these were small acts of rebellion for the townspeople who resented the military men standing watch up at the factory. The convent was located in the northern outskirts of town, almost directly down the slope from the factory. It was a round slab of milk-white stone with a turreted roof that made the building look like a tower in search of a castle. The large chapel it abutted was constructed of sturdy rough-hewn logs and fronted by an entrance of ash branches woven into complicated knots. They left their sledge at the stables and rang the bell at the convent's side door. A young woman in the embroidered pale blue pinafore of a novitiate answered, and a moment later they were meeting the well-mother. The older woman wore dark blue wool and had a round apple-cheeked face, her skin deeply lined as if it had been pleated into neat, pallid folds instead of wrinkled by age. Nina made the introductions, explaining that she was serving as a translator for a merchant couple selling their wares, and asked if they might stay somewhere on the property while exploring the area. Do they have any fjerdan at all? Fine, said Adric. Some. De fornen, added Leonie with a smile. We're learning. And where is your husband? The well-mother asked Nina. Gone to the waters, Nina said, dropping her eyes to the silver ring on her hand. Made Gel wedge over him. A soldier then, a fisherman. Ah, well, she said, as if dissatisfied with such a bloodless death. I can give you and the Zemani woman rooms on the bottom floor near the kitchens, but her husband will have to stay in the stables. I doubt he'd be much harm to the girls, she said with a glance at the pinned sleeve of Adric's coat. But even so. It was the kind of thoughtless comment people often made around Adric, but all he did was smile pleasantly and offer up payment for the week with his remaining hand. The well-mother instructed them on the routine of the convent as she led them through the dining hall and down to the stable. The doors are locked at 10 bells every night and are not reopened until the morning. We ask that you keep to reading or silent meditation at a time so as not to disturb the girls at their studies. Are they all novitiates? Nina asked. Some will become spring maidens, others are here to be educated until they return to their families or husbands. What are you transporting under there anyway? The well-mother asked, lifting the corner of the tarp attached to the sledge. Nina's instinct was to slap the woman's hand away. Instead, she stepped forward eagerly and reached for the tie securing the tarp. This couple had invented a new form of rifle loader. Right on cue, Leonie drew a colorful pamphlet from her coat. They're affordably priced, and we're projecting big sales in on the new year, she said. We're looking for a few small investors, if you'd like a demonstration. No, indeed, the well-mother said quickly. I'm sure they're most impressive, but I'm afraid the convent's finances are simply too tight for speculative ventures. It never failed. We serve our meals at 6 bells following morning prayers, which you are, of course, encouraged to join. And in the evening again at 6 bells. Bread and salt are available in the kitchen. Water is rationed. Rationed? Asked Nina. Yes, we draw from the well at Felsted, and that requires quite a journey. Isn't Kela closer? The well mother's plump lips pursed. There are many ways in which we show service to Gel. The trip provides good opportunity for quiet contemplation. Rivers gone sour out by the old fort. So the well mother didn't want her charges drinking from this tributary of the river, but she also wasn't willing to discuss it. It was possible the spring maidens were just laundering soldiers' uniforms, but it was also likely they knew what was happening at the factory. As soon as the well mother had gone, Adric said, let's walk. Nina checked the lashings of the tarp, and they headed up the side of the mountain, setting a leisurely pace and making a show of chattering loudly in Samine. They paralleled the road that led to the factory, but they took time to point out birds and stop at vistas overlooking the valley. 3 tourists out for a walk and nothing more. Will you be all right in the stables? Leonie asked as they made their way through a grove of pines. I'll manage, said Adric. A one-armed lecher can still prey upon the horses. The well mother never thought of that. Leonie laughed and said, It's the wolves who go unseen that eat the most sheep. Adric snorted, but he looked almost pleased. Behind them, Nina rolled her eyes. If she was going to be forced to continue a mission with 2 people starting this dance of cautious compliments and sudden blushes, it might well kill her. It was one thing to find happiness and lose it, quite another to have someone else's happiness thrust at you like an unwanted second slice of cake. Then again, she never refused a second slice of cake. This will be good for me, she told herself, like green vegetables and lessons in arithmetic, and I'll probably enjoy it just as much. Eventually, they picked their way to a gap in the trees that overlooked the entrance to the factory. At the sight of it, the rustling of voices rose in her mind, louder than the wind shaking the pines. 2 soldiers were posted at the huge double doors, and there were more stationed along the parapets. It was a fort before it was a factory, Nina said, pointing to what looked like old niches carved into the stone walls. A large reservoir sat behind the main building, and she wondered if the water was used for cooling whatever machinery was operating inside. It's a good strategic vantage, I suppose, said Adric in his dreary voice. High ground, a safe place to shelter in, an attack, or when the river spills its banks. The might of Gel, thought Nina. The wellspring, the wrath of the river. 2 smokestacks belched grey-blue smoke into the late afternoon sky as they watched the cover wagon roll up to the gate. It was impossible to tell what passed between the guards and the driver. What do you think is in that wagon? Asked Adric. Could be anything, said Leonie. Or from the mines, fish, bushels of jurda. Nina ran her hands over her arms and glanced at the smokestacks. Not jurda. I would smell it. Small doses of ordinary jurda had helped her to survive her ordeal with Parim, but had left her with an acute sensitivity to it. What do you think? She asked Adric. Do we stay? I think I want to look inside that fort. But I'll settle for knowing what the hell they leaked into the water. It could be from the mines, said Leonie. If it were the mines, the fishermen would have rioted to have them shut down. Fear is keeping the townspeople quiet. Let's draw samples of the water, Leonie said. If I can isolate the pollutants, we might be able to figure out what they're doing inside the fort. You're equipped for that? Adric said. Not exactly. I came prepared to forge documents, not test for poisons. But I could probably rig something up. If I told you we needed magical dust to make me vomit peppermints, you'd probably say I could rig something up. Probably, Leonie replied with a grin. I just have to try. Adric shook his head in disbelief. I'm getting tired even contemplating it. I'll need time, said Leonie, and Nina saw a troubled shadow pass over her face. Poisons are tricky work. We can't stay here for too long without drawing suspicion, said Adric. There's not enough trade passing through to justify it, and I don't want us snowbound if a bad storm hits. I know, Nina said. She had pushed them to come here, and she hoped they had more to find than a recommissioned munitions factory. Give it a week. A silence followed, and Nina sensed the shared concern that passed between Leonie and Adric. Leonie touched Nina's hand gently. Nina, she began, and Nina knew what she was going to say. The whispering rose in her head again, but Nina ignored it. Instead, she looked at the valley, at the dense forest, the gleaming tributary slicing through the trees like a glittering chain in a jewel box, the tidy little town bisected by the road. It did not feel like enemy territory here. It felt like a quiet place where people came to build their homes and try to make a life for themselves, where the business of soldiers and wars was nothing but an intrusion. In another life, she and Matthews might have made their home in a place like this. They would have argued about how close they should live to a city. Nina would have longed for people and excitement. Matthews would have crumpled for quiet. They would have found a way to compromise. They would have argued and kissed to make up. But where would that But where would they have ever felt safe together? In Ferda? In Ravka? Was there any place they would have truly been free and happy? Another life, another world. It's time, Nina. Return me to my God. Nina drew in a long breath and said, I'll need 2 days to take him where the water is clean. Saying the words was like feeling her heart split. The heavy swing of the axe blade sinking past bark to the soft white wood. You shouldn't go alone, said Adric without enthusiasm. It sounded like he was contemplating putting on a sudden pair of socks. I can go by my... A noise sounded from somewhere below. They stilled, bodies tense, waiting. Silence. And then a shout. The meadow, whispered Nina. Adric started down the hill and signaled for them to follow, his glum demeanor vanishing in an instant as the hardened fighter emerged. They kept to the shadows, moving with care, creeping closer. Soldiers, hissed Leonie, peering through the branches. A group of young men in grey Verdan uniforms were gathered around the stream, shouting at one another. 2 were on horseback, the others had dismounted and were trying to calm a horse that had somehow gotten spooked and thrown its rider. Nina could see the soldier's boot had caught in the stirrup, and he was being dragged through the stream as the horse cantered back and forth in the shallows, barely missing the soldier's head with its hoofs. All it would take was a single heavy strike, and the boy's skull would be crushed. We should help them, said Leonie. Should get back to the safety of the town, said Adric. They'll manage. And that's one less Verdan soldier to plague us, Nina said beneath her breath. Nina. Adric and Leonie stared at her. Adric looked like a mourner in search of a wig, and even Leonie's usual sunshine was clouded with worry. She didn't approve. Adric didn't approve. Hell, in her heart, Nina didn't approve either. But since Matthias had left her, been taken from her, Nina had lost a part of her that cared. What was the point of it all? You save one life only to see another taken. The good perished, and the bad? Nina looked at the young Verdans in their uniforms, killers in the making. What right did they have to survive when her Matthias, her beautiful barbarian, was gone? Nina. She wished she could clap her hands over her ears and tell him to leave her alone, but that was the last thing she wanted. Must you insist I stay human? She complained silently. I know how strong you are, Nina. My death will not be the thing that defeats you. What are we even supposed to do? Nina said aloud. I know my way around horses, Leonie offered. Adric rolled his eyes. Here we go. It will ingratiate us with the locals, insisted Leonie. Already pushing through the trees, we could use some soldier friends. Soldier friends? Nina asked incredulously. Come on, said Adric. If we leave Leonie to her own devices, she may invite them to a slumber party. Kedredin, yelled one of the soldiers as they entered the clearing. Strangers, he sounded like a child. Can we be of help? Nina called in Verdan. No, he cried from the riverbank. Stay back. That was when Nina realized they weren't men at all. They were young women dressed as Verdan soldiers. Nina held up her hands and tried to make peace. Let us help your comrade. My Zemanite friend knows horses. She really hoped that was the case and not just Leonie's optimistic take on I once bet a pony. Leonie walked to the edge of the stream, making a low nickering sound and murmuring in Zemanite. She moved slowly left and right, arms spread open. I need rope, she said quietly, without looking away from the horse. One of the riders came forward. She had to be 6 feet tall and was all wiry muscle. Her skin had the warm, tawny brown cast that usually indicated Hedjit ancestry this far north, and a few wisps of the russet hair were visible beneath her army-ish cap. Now that they were closer, Nina could see their uniforms were all too big, ill-fitting, stolen. The tall girl's chin just jutted forward. She was around Nina's age, and whatever fear she had at being discovered, she was hiding it well. She tossed a rope to Nina, who passed it to Leonie, keeping her distance. What were these girls doing? Women didn't serve in the Verdan military. They didn't ride often, and when they did, they certainly didn't ride astride. They didn't even wear trousers, as heavy skirts intended to preserve their modesty. The girl caught in the stirrups moaned, struggling to right herself in the shallows. She had straw-yellow hair that had come loose around her shoulders, and she was bleeding badly from a cut on her forehead, but she was alive and her skull was still in one piece for the moment. Leonie kept her eyes fastened on the horse as she twisted the rope into a lasso. She swung it in gentle, lazy loops, her voice continuing that low, soothing murmur as they all stood watching. Then, without breaking her rhythm, she tossed the lasso in a gentle arc. It landed perfectly over the horse's head, and the beast reared with a high whinny. Leonie moved left and right again, turning the rope, leaning back, using her strength but not fighting. At last the horse settled. The tall girl who had given Nina the rope stepped forward, but Leonie gave a quick shake of her head. Let her be, Nina said quietly. A flush spread over the girl's sharp jaw. Leonie approached the horse slowly and rested her hand on its neck, stroking its mane down the withers. "Something scare you?" she said in Zemini, cautiously making her way around the horse's flank. She bent to the stirrup but gestured to the girl lying glazed eye in the water to stay still. She didn't want to risk the horse shying again. Nina hoped the girl was conscious enough to understand. "Nothing to worry about," murmured Leonie. She released the girl's boot from the stirrup, then quickly tugged on the rope and led the horse away. For a long moment the fallen girl lay in the water. Then she released a sob and pushed herself up. Her companions ran to her, pulling her from the stream. Leonie brought the horse to where Nina was standing with the tall girl. "Any idea what spooked him?" she asked in Zemini. Nina translated, but the tall girl didn't respond. She just narrowed her coppery eyes. "What are you doing out here?" "Other than saving your friend's life," Nina replied mildly. "I hardly think she would have died." "No? Just bled until she passed out from her concussion, or until the horse trampled her into a coma?" "We had it under control," she insisted. Then she glanced up at the trees. "You came from the northern woods. There's nothing up there." "So we soon learned. We're new to these parts." "Is exploring considered a crime in Gaffel?" "There's a vantage of the factory up that way." "Ah," said Nina, and turned to Alec and Leonie. "The building we saw was some kind of factory. Best to keep to their ruse in case any of these women spoke a little Zemini." She turned back to the tall one. "You thought it looked a bit like a fort. What is it they make you there?" she asked innocently. "It isn't my business, and I doubt it's yours. You're staying at the convent?" Just how much did this girl know? And why was she so hostile? Maybe she was a soldier's sister, raised to be suspicious. Nina's hands twitched, and she felt the bone shard shift. She didn't want to hurt this girl, but she would if she had to. The last thing they needed was someone running home to talk about the strangers in the woods who had been spying on the factory. Then the tall girl clenched her fists and said, "Aye, will you not tell the well-mother you saw us here?" Suddenly the girl's defensiveness made her more sense. The stolen uniforms, the excursions into the woods in the middle of the day. She had been trying to go on the attack, but she was legitimately frightened of being discovered. "Your novitiates?" Nina asked. "We're all being educated at the convent. Some will marry, some will become spring maidens and give their life to Gel." She didn't sound like either prospect excited her. Nina adopted a more serious mien and realized it was Matthias' manner she was mimicking. Riding astride, wearing trousers, cavorting in the woods with no chaperone. It would be irresponsible for us to not say anything to the well-mother, especially given the generosity of our hosts. The tall girl turned ashen, and Nina felt a stab of guilt. If she was really close to Nina's age, she was too old to be a novitiate. All of them were. Were these the outsiders then, the girls who hadn't been chosen for brides? What happened to Fjerdan women who didn't find a place as wives or mothers? Ravka was broken in many ways, but at least their Nina had been allowed to train as a soldier, to become what she was meant to be. Free to fight and die alongside your men? Yes, Matthias, free. What would he have made of these girls in their stolen clothes? "Where did you get those uniforms?" Nina asked. "The laundry. The soldiers sent their clothes to the convent for the cleaning." "Then you're a thief too," said Nina. She might feel for these girls, but she wasn't about to break cover for them. "We were only borrowing them. It was a lark. We won't do it again." Nina doubted that. This wasn't the first or the last time these girls would borrow uniforms or horses. From a distance, they could maintain the ruse that they were soldiers out to train and roam the countryside with a freedom they would never otherwise enjoy. But at what risk? Nina couldn't imagine the punishment if they were discovered. "What say you, Adric?" Nina asked, deferring to the man in the party as a proper Fjerdan girl would, even if he was a foreigner. Adric cast a judgmental eye over the novitiates, pretending to consider. "Very well, let us not speak of this day." Nina nodded to the tall girl, whose shoulders sagged in relief. The others looked relieved too as they pulled their injured friend onto a saddle. "Get her home and healed," Nina said with the prim superiority of a student who would never ever break the rules. "You should say thanks tonight in your prayers to Gel that he would tolerate such recklessness in his servants." The tall girl bowed. "Gel Gerendem," she mounted her horse. "And we had better not see you out here again," said Adric in clumsy Fjerdan. "No, sir, of course not," said the girl, but as she turned, Nina glimpsed a defiant spark in her copper eyes. The others might be cowed, but not this girl. She had a different kind of heart. She would ride, she would hunt, she would fight when she could, and that was how she would stay alive. When the novitiates had gone from the clearing, Nina said, "They're not going to talk." "No," said Adric. "They were clearly terrified that we'd be the ones to speak to the well-mother. Let's fill our canteens. We can take the samples back to the stables." But Nina wasn't quite ready to leave the mountain. The whispering had started again, and she was going to ignore it this time. I want to take another look at the factory. Why? How to answer that? I just think there might be more to see. The chorus inside her sighed. Adric looked skeptical. Go, but be careful, and do not engage on your own, understood? Nina nodded, but apparently Adric saw something he didn't like in her expression. Nina, do not engage. If you're caught, it will put all of our operations here in Ferda at risk. That is an order, not a request. Yes, sir, Nina said, and she managed it without a hint of the frustration she felt. Obedience had never been one of her strong points, and she'd been making her own decisions for far too long. But she wanted to be a soldier for Ravka, and that meant learning to do what she was told all over again. Trussell didn't like following my orders. I bribed him with bits of steak. Really, Matthias? Should I just try biting Adric the next time it annoys me? I am not a wolf. I am a gently bred lady. Though steak does sound good. Leonie and I will take samples here and the tributary closer to town, Adric said, and Nina was glad he couldn't read her mind. Be back before dark. Nina headed into the trees, taking her time cutting back to the factory on the off chance she was observed. She didn't follow the road this time. Instead, she listened to the whispers, and she didn't think she was imagining their excitement as she scaled the mountain, letting them guide her farther east. Their anticipation drove her tired legs onward, the rustle growing louder, the sound of a crowd chattering its excitement before the start of a play, or perhaps an execution. It was almost sunset when she finally saw the fort come back into view. Why does adventure always involve so much hiking? She wondered. She somehow tracked behind the building so that she was on the far side of it, closest to the eastern wing. At this angle, she could see there was a dirt road that led to another gate, two bored-looking guards bracketing it. This part of the factory seemed to have fallen into disrepair. Some of the windows were broken, and she saw no signs of occupation. She also had a better view of the reservoir, its retaining wall carved into the shape of a giant ash tree, its branches and roots radiating in thick, twisting bulges of hewstone. No doubt it had been blessed when the dam had been built. Wherever water was used or contained, the Ferdans said prayers. At mills and in harbors, in the great northern mines where holy words were carved into the ice every season. A round sluice gate sat at the base of the dam, and Nina could see a refuse in the mud that surrounded it. Soiling Gel's waters was considered a crime punishable by death in Fierda. Perhaps these soldiers were particularly religious. There was nothing to see here, but the whispering in Nina's head had risen to a clamor, and now she could hear that the voices were not excited. They were anguished. Nina reached out with her power, the thing that Param had created within her. She felt the flow of the invisible river that no man could contain. It was death, a cold and inevitable tide, and when she had focused, she could sense where it rushed and where it ended. She let her mind dive into that cold, seeking those voices. Where are you? She asked the darkness. Who are you? She gasped as the current seized her, as if to drag her along, to pull her into the deep. The wailing inside her rose like a terrible flood. Death wanted to claim her. She could feel it, and did some part of her want to let it have its way? Nina, come back. The water did not feel cold anymore. It felt kind, like a welcome. Nina, do not give in to the tide. Nina's eyes flashed open. The world of the living enveloped her again. Birdsong, the wet scent of the soil beneath her boots, the sound of small creatures moving through the brush. She looked at the hulking shape of the factory and felt a deep chill sink into her bones. The voices had receded, but she could still hear them crying. She knew who they were. Women and girls in the hundreds. All of them dead. Here on this mountaintop, Nina was surrounded by graves. My gosh, girl. Intense. Alright, now we're going for chapter 6. Nikolai. Nikolai and Toya brought David and Nadia back to the capital by way of the underground tunnel that stretched from the Gilded Bog all the way to the grounds of the Grand Palace, 15 miles of travel far beneath the surface of the earth. Poor Toya muttered to himself the entire way, in verse. Nikolai would have liked to spare Toya and his own ears the trauma of the journey, but his head of security had insisted he was fine. Besides, Nikolai had received word that the crowd of pilgrims camped outside the city walls had grown in recent days, and that some were demanding an audience with the king. All he needed was for an overzealous zealot to hurl himself beneath the hooves of one of the royal riders. Nikolai didn't intend to make any martyrs today. They emerged behind a noisy man-made waterfall not far from the royal stables. The path to it monitored by two of Nikolai's most trusted palace guards. In their white and gold uniforms, dark hair parted neatly on the side. Both of their faces cast in the solemn disinterest of soldiers at attention. The guards might have been brothers, but they couldn't have been less alike in disposition. Trekhin was always laughing and full of bravado. Isaac was so shy he often struggled to make eye contact. The guards registered no surprise as Nikolai's party appeared from between the hedges. Trekhin, Nikolai said, "What excitement did I miss on my travels?" Trekhin's stern expression gave way instantly to an easy smile. "Welcome back, Your Highness. Not much to report here, though an inferni did set fire to the woods behind the lake. Sounds like Kuei." Nikolai admired the shoeboy's gift for Mayhem, especially because the young inferni was Zoya's problem to manage. "That doesn't sound too bad." Dragon's grin turned rueful. "I believe the Minister of Defense was caught in the blaze, but he suffered no injuries. As long as no one set fire to the Minister of Finance." "Kavanenye?" Nikolai asked Isaac and Zeminai. He had discovered the guard's gift for languages during his service as Hamhen and encouraged Isaac to foster those talents. Isaac bowed slightly. "Your accent is coming along nicely, Your Majesty." "Don't coddle me, Isaac." The guard cleared his throat. "Well, the Zeminai word for day is Khan, not Kav, unless you meant to ask how my donkey is going." "I wish your donkey well, but you should always feel free to correct me when I make mistakes." "Yes, Your Highness," Isaac said uncomfortably. "Don't worry," said Nikolai as they turned their backs on the gardens and headed toward the Grand Palace. "It doesn't happen often." Easy words, old words, harder to prove true with every passing day. Through the trees, Nikolai glimpsed the gilded terraces of the Grand Palace, stacked like the frosted layers of the world's most expensive tea cake. His ancestors had enjoyed an excess of everything except good taste, but he would not be stopping there just yet. He veered left toward the little palace instead, passing through the woods and emerging to the side of its golden domes, the gleaming blue lake with a tiny island at its center visible just beyond. Nikolai had spent plenty of time here, and yet there was something about this place. The soaring towers, the ancient wooden walls inlaid with mother of pearl and carved with every manner of flower and beast. He always felt he was traveling into foreign territory, leaving the new world behind for some place where dark bargains might be struck. He should probably stop reading novels. Grisha were everywhere in their brightly colored kefta, uniforms Tolya and Tamar had resolutely refused to wear, opting for the olive drab of First Army soldiers instead. The twins kept their arms bare, their deep bronze skin tattooed with the markings of the sun saint. Zoya and Genya were already waiting in the war room. "You're late," said Zoya. "I'm the king," said Nikolai. "That means you're early." For most state matters, the Grisha triumvirate attended Nikolai at the Grand Palace, in the same room where he met with his ministers and governors. But when they needed to talk, really talk without fear of being overheard, they came here, to the chambers the Darkling had built. He was a man who had excelled at keeping secrets. The war room had no windows and only a single entrance that couldn't be accessed without breaching the little palace itself. The walls were lined with maps of Ravka made in the old style. They would have enchanted Nikolai as a child, had he ever been allowed anywhere near the palace. "We're in trouble," Nikolai said without preamble, and settled himself in a chair at the head of the table with a cup of tea perched on his knee. "Saying we're in trouble is like saying Tolya is hungry," replied Zoya, ignoring Tolya's scowl and pouring herself tea from the samovar. "Am I supposed to be surprised?" She had dressed in the blue wool kafta that most etherealki wore in cold weather. Silver embroidery at its cuffs and hem, gray fox fur at its collar. She showed little sign of fatigue despite the days and nights of travel that had brought them back to Osalta. Zoya was always a general, and her impeccable appearance was part of her armor. Nikolai glanced at his perfectly shined boots. It was a trait he respected. "But this is particularly delicious trouble," he said. "Oh no," groaned Genya. "When you talk that way, things are always about to go horribly wrong." Her kefta was corporalky red, only a shade darker than her hair, its cuffs embroidered in dark blue, a combination worn only by Genya and her regiment of tailors. But the cuffs and hem of Genya's kefta were always detailed with golden thread to match the sun emblazoned over her eye patch in remembrance of Alina Starkov. Nikolai had added the sun in ascendance to his own lance of heraldry. a gesture he could admit had been driven by the need to court public opinion as much as by personal sentiment. Still, it sometimes felt like Alina was trailing them from room to room, her presence as tangible as the heat of a summer sun, though the girl was long gone. Ooh. Nikolai tapped his spoon against his cup. David and Nadia are close to perfecting the weapon system on the Ismarsha. David didn't bother to look up from the reading he'd brought with him, a treatise on osmotic filters that Nikolai had found most helpful. You're right, Kenya, this must be very serious trouble. Kenya cocked her head to the side. Why do you say that? He's starting with the good news. Nikolai and Zoya exchanged a glance, and Zoya said, Hiram Shinek approached the king at the trade summit in Ivets. The Kerch Merchant Council knows about our underwater fleet. Tamar pushed back her chair in frustration. Dang it, I knew we'd had a leak at the old facility. We should have moved to Les Leon sooner. They were going to find it eventually, said Talia. David mumbled, There are peaceable applications for the submersibles. Research exploration. He never liked to think of himself as a maker of weapons, but they couldn't afford to be so naive. Tamar leaned against the wall and propped up her heel. Let's not pretend we don't know what the Kerch intend to use our sharks for. Hiram Schneck and the merchants of the Kerch Council claimed they wanted the Ismarsha as a defensive measure against their shrew neighbors and the possibility of Fjerdan blockades. But Nikolai knew better. They all did. The Kerch already had a target in mind. Zemanai ships. The Zemanai had been building up their navy and establishing their own trade routes. They no longer needed Kerch ports or Kerch vessels, and for the first time, the mighty Kerch, who had ruled the seas and the world's trade undisputed for so long, had competition to worry about. Not only that, but the Zemanai had advantages the Kerch couldn't match. Extensive farmland, timber, and mines of their own. If Nikolai was honest, he was jealous of the way the young country had thrived. This was what a nation could do without enemies at their borders, unburdened by the constant threat of war. But if the Kerch Merchant Council obtained the plans to Ravka's fleet of sharks, there would be no quarter of Zemanai ships. They could be attacked anywhere, and the Kerch would regain their monopoly of the seas, a monopoly that had made them one of the wealthiest and most powerful nations in the world, despite their tiny size. The Zemanai have been strong allies, said Talia. They've lent us aid, stood with us when no one else would. Tamar folded her arms. But they can't forgive our loans. The Kerch controlled Ravka's debt. They could cripple us with the stroke of a pen. Nikolai contemplated the map before him. Shuhan to the south, Fjerda to the north, Ravka caught between them. If Ravka couldn't maintain his borders, his nation would become little more than a battleground between two great powers. And Nikolai had promised his people peace, a chance to rebuild. Both the Fjerdans and the Shu possessed vast standing armies, while the Ravkan army was depleted from years of waging war on two fronts. When Nikolai had taken command of Ravka's forces after the Civil War, he had known they could not match their enemies' numbers. Ravka could only survive by using innovations to stay one step ahead. His country did not want to be at war again. He did not want to be at war again. That to build flyers, ships, or weapons in any quantity that would matter, they needed money and access to resources that only Kerch loans could provide. The decision seemed simple, except no decision was ever simple, even if one was willing to put thoughts of honor and allies aside. You're both right, Nikolai said. We need the Zemanai and we need the Kerch, but we can't choose two partners in this dance. All right, said Zoya. Who do we want to go home with when the music stops? Tamar tapped her heel against the wall. It has to be the Kerch. Let's not make any rash decisions, said Nikolai. Pick the wrong partner and we could be in for a disappointing night. He removed a vial of cloudy green liquid from his pocket and set it on the table. Zoya drew in a sharp breath and Genya leaned forward. Is that what I think it is? Asked Zoya. Nikolai nodded. Because of the information we gleaned from Kuei Yulbo, our alchemy are close to perfecting an antidote to Parem. Kenya pressed her hands together. There were tears in her single amber eye. Then, Nikolai hated to quell her hope, but they all needed to understand the reality of the situation. Unfortunately, the formula for the antidote requires huge amounts of jur de stocks, 10 times the number of plants it would take to create an ounce of jur de parem. Zoya picked up the vial, turned it over in her hands. Jurda only grows in Novi Zem. No other climate will sustain it. We need an antidote, said Tamar. All of our intelligent points to the Shu and the Fjerdans being closer to developing a usable strain of Parem. More Grisha enslaved, said Zoya. More Grisha used as weapons against Ravka. More Grisha dead. She set the vial back on the table. If we give the courage to plans to the Ismartia, we'll lose Novia Zem as an ally and our chance to protect our Grisha. Maybe the world's Grisha from Parem. With a tap of her finger, she set the vial spinning in a slow circle. If we say no to the courage, then we won't have the money to adequately arm and equip the first army. Either way, we lose. Genya turned to Nikolai. He'll make a diplomatic trip then. Visit the Kirch, visit the Zemanai. Do that thing you do where you use too many words to say something simple and confuse the issue. I'd like nothing better than another opportunity to talk, said Nikolai, but I'm afraid I have more bad news. Genya slumped in her chair. There's more? This is Ravka, said Zoya. There's always more. Nikolai had known this moment was coming, and yet he still wished he could make some kind of excuse and bring the meeting to a halt. So sorry, friends. I'm needed in the greenhouse in a matter of national security. No one else can prune the peonies. Though everyone here knew what had been happening to him, it still felt like a dirty secret. He did not want to let the demon into the room, but this had to be said. While the Zoya and I were away, the monster took hold of me again. I broke free at the Duke's estate and made a delightful sojourn to a local goose farm. But the sleeping tonic, Genya began, the monster is getting stronger. There, now, he said it. Not a bit of a waver in his voice, not even the barest note of worry, though he wanted to choke on the words. Genya shuddered better than anyone. She understood the darkness living inside Nikolai. It was tied to Nichevia, to the very monsters that had terrorized her. The Darkling had set his shadow soldiers upon her when she betrayed him. She had lost an eye to his creatures, and their bites had left her body covered in scars that could not be tailored away. Nikolai still marveled at the particular cruelty of it all. The Darkling had known that Genya valued beauty as her shield, so he had taken it from her. He had known that Nikolai relied on his mind, his talent for thinking his way out of any situation, so he'd let the demon steal Nikolai's ability to speak and think rationally. The Darkling could have killed either of them, but he had wanted to punish them instead. He might have been an ancient power, but he certainly had a petty streak. David, Genya said, her skin pale beneath her scars. Is that possible? Could it be getting stronger? David brushed his shaggy brown hair back from his eyes. It shouldn't be, he said. Not after it was dormant for so long. But the power that created the presence inside the king wasn't ordinary Grisha power. It was Merzost. Abomination, murmured Tolia. Are we calling it a presence now? Asked Nikolai. I preferred monster or demon. Even Fen has a nice ring. The monster is me, and I am the monster. And if Nikolai didn't laugh at it, he was fairly sure he'd go mad. We can name it Maribel if it suits you, Zoya said, pushing away her empty cup. It doesn't matter what we call it, only what it can do. It matters if we're misunderstanding its nature, said David. You've read Grisha theory, Morozova's journals. Grisha power cannot create life or animate matter, only manipulate it. Every time those limits are breached, there are repercussions. The shadow fold, said Nikolai. The swath of darkness crawling with monsters had split Ravka in two until Alina Starkov had destroyed it during the Civil War. But the wound remained, a wasteland of dead sand where nothing green took hold, as if the darkness power had leached the very life from the land. Mersos had created the fold, the creatures inside it, as well as the Darkling shadow soldiers, and it was the same power that the Darkling had used to infect Nikolai. David shrugged. That power is unpredictable. We don't know what may happen next, said Nikolai, usually a thrilling proposition. Less so when a demon may take over my consciousness and try to rule Ravka by gnawing on my subjects. How did the words come so easily, even as he contemplated losing his mind and his will? Because they always had, and he needed them. He needed to build a wall of words and wit and reason to keep the beast at bay, to remember who he was, to rid himself of the monster. Nikolai had allowed himself to be subjected to extreme heat and cold. He had brought in bewildered sun summoners to use their power on him with no discernible results except the sensation that he was being gently roasted from the inside. His agents had scoured libraries the world over and retrieved the journals of the legendary fabricator Ilya Morozova, after months of excavation in the rubble of the spinning wheel, all with nothing to show for it but frustration. That frustration had led him to Yvette's, to the Bone Bridge, in some futile attempt to draw a connection between the darkness within him and the strange happenings around Ravka. Maybe he'd been hoping the saints would present him with a miracle, but thus far, divine intervention had been in short supply. So you see the problem? He said now. I cannot travel without risking exposure, but I cannot stay in hiding at the capital without drawing suspicion and risking Ravka's future with the Zemina and the Kirch. Did I not promise particularly delicious trouble? I'm sorry, said Genya. Exactly what is it delicious about this? That we were going to get out of it. Nikolai slouched back in his chair and stretched his leg, crossing them at the ankle. We're going to throw a party. I see, said Zoya. How drunk am I expected to get before this all starts looking better? I fear there isn't enough wine in all of Kirigan's cellar, conceded Nikolai, and I regret to say we'll need to be sober for this. The Kirch, the Semenai, the Ferdens, and the Shu. We're going to bring them all here. We're going to stage a little performance so that they know Ravka and his king are in perfect health. Is that all? Said Zoya. Will you be taking up juggling as well? Don't be ridiculous, Nikolai replied. I already know how to juggle, literally and figuratively. We'll renew our alliance with the Zemanite, but the Kirch, Genya began, and we'll give the Kirch a secret look at our prototype of the Ismarsia. We will? Asked David. It will be an utter catastrophe, of course. Perhaps a nice explosion, some flying metal, maybe we can pretend to drown a few sailors. Whatever will convince the Kirch our sharks aren't seaworthy and buy us the most time. Nikolai could almost feel the demon recede, feel its claws retract, driven back by the prospect of a course of action. We're going to get all of those diplomats and merchants and politicians under our roof. We get everyone talking, and then we listen. Zoya, we'll need your squallers to create an acoustic map so we have ears everywhere. I don't like that. I knew you wouldn't, said Nikolai. It isn't ethical to spy on one's own guests. And that is why your sister is the head of my intelligence network. Kings need spies, and spies can't afford to fiddle about with ethics. Do you have a problem with overseeing an eavesdropping campaign, Tamar? Not in the least. There you have it. Tamar considered. I like the idea of tackling them all at once. But what possible reason could we have for bringing our enemies and allies beneath this roof that won't draw even more suspicion? We could celebrate our Sense Day, said Genya enthusiastically. Sledding, bonfires. No, said Nikolai. I don't want to wait for the feast of Sankt Nikolai. He certainly couldn't count on the demon to delay. The party will take place 6 weeks from now. We'll call it the Festival of Autumn Nonsense or something like that. Celebrate the equinox, gifts of the harvest. Very symbolic. 6 weeks? Exclaimed Genya. We can't possibly organize an event of that size in such a short time. The security concerns alone. Nikolai winked at her. If I had anyone but Genya Safin in charge, I might be worried. Zoya rolled her eyes. She doesn't need your flattery. She already thinks enough of herself. Let him go on, said Genya. David never gives me pretty compliments. Don't I? Asked David. He patted his pocket absently. I have the list of your good qualities you gave me somewhere. You see what I endure? I need to keep Genya happy, said Nikolai, or she may turn on me. I may turn on you, said Zoya. Oh, that's unavoidable. But you're immune to compliments. Zoya lifted a shoulder. Then I suggest gifts of jewels and cash. She rose, and he could see her mind at work, the general contemplating her attack. She paced slowly before the map, the fold appearing and disappearing behind her. If we're going to bring these powers here, we need to have a better reason than a festival of gourds and wheat sheaves. Zoya, Nikolai warned. He knew exactly what she was thinking. This is the perfect opportunity for you to find a bride. Absolutely not. But Zoya had the smug look of a woman who had won an argument before it had begun. As you said, you can no longer travel. So it's essential that prospective brides come to you. He shook his head. I cannot take a bride. The risks are too great. That's exactly why you must, said Zoya. We can bring these powers together. I even believe you have the charm and guile to outmaneuver our enemies. But how much time can you buy us? 6 months? A year? Then what, your highness? It is an ideal reason to bring them all here, said Genya. Nikolai grimaced. I knew you would turn on me. I just didn't think it would be so soon. Nikolai, Zoya said quietly. You said the monster is getting stronger. If that's true, this may be your best chance. Your only chance, the words hung and said. Ravka needed a queen. Nikolai needed an heir. And yet every part of him rebelled at the thought of marriage. He did not have time to properly court someone with so much work to be done. He did not want to wed someone he barely knew. He did not dare reveal his secrets to a stranger. The danger to the woman he chose would be too great. All good reasons, all convincing excuses. But the monsters had set the clock ticking. Nikolai looked around the room. These people knew him as no one else did. They trusted him. But the demon lurking inside him might change all that. What if it grew stronger and continued to erode his control, to eat at the will that had guided him for so long? Abomination. He remembered the way Genya had shuddered. What if he was the drowning man and it was Ravka he would drag down with him? Nikolai drew in a long breath. Why put off the inevitable? Surely there was something to be said for the firing squad instead of slow torture. We'll need to come up with a list of candidates, he said. Zoya grinned. Done. She really was ready to be rid of him. You're going to manage this like a military campaign, aren't you? It is a military campaign. My ministers and ambassadors will have their suggestions too. We'll invite them all, said Genya, drawing pen and ink toward her, unable to disguise her excitement. We cannot house everyone at the palace. Just think of all the dinners and teas and dancing. Just think of all the dinners and teas and dancing, said David glumly. Genya set her pen aside and seized his hands. I promise to let you hide in your workshop. Just give me 5 events and 1 banquet. 3 events and 1 banquet. 4. Very well. You're a dreadful negotiator, said Nikolai. She would have settled for 2. David frowned. Is that true? Absolutely not, said Genya. And do shut up, Your Highness. We'll need to run additional checks on all palace security, Nikolai said to Talia. Anticipate that every servant, every guard, every lady in waiting will be a potential spy or assassin. Speaking of which, said Tamar, Dunyasha Lazareva is dead. The Lantsov pretender? Who got her? Not one of ours. All I know is they found her splattered on the cobblestones outside the Church of Barter after the auction. Troubling. Had she been in Ketterdam to hunt him? She wasn't the only pretender to the Lantsov throne. Every few months it seemed a new person cropped up to declare that they were a lost Lantsov heir. Someone who insisted they'd escaped the darkling slaughter of the royal family, or who claimed to be a byblow of Nikolai's father, which, given the old king's favor, was entirely plausible. Of course, Nikolai might very well have less right to the Ravkan throne than half of them. He was the greatest pretender of them all. There will be another, said Zoya. Someone else who claimed the Lantsov name. All the more reason to produce an heir and secure the throne. I said I would choose a bride, and I will, Nikolai said, trying not to sound quite as petulant as he felt. I'll even get down on one knee and recite some love poetry if you like. I could make some selections, offered Talia, looking genuinely happy for the first time since they'd gone underground at the Gilded Bog. An excellent idea. Keep it short and make sure it rhymes. Nikolai looked again at the old map of Ravka, violent, hopeless, unappeasable in its constant need. Ravka was his first love, an infatuation that had begun in his lonely boyhood and had only deepened with age. Whatever it demanded, he knew he would give. He'd been reckless with his country he claimed to love, and he could no longer let his fear dictate Ravka's future. Send the invitations, he said. Let the great royal romance begin. The rest of the day was spent in meetings with ministers making plans for roads and aqueducts they could not afford, writing letters to the Kirch to request extensions on their loans, and finishing correspondence with everyone from the ruling marshal of the Wandering Isle to the admirals in his navy, requesting funds for repairs to the existing Ravkan fleet. All of it required concentration, finesse, and infinite patience, and all of it was less onerous than the work of finding a queen. But eventually, evening came, and Nikolai was forced to face Zoya and her army of prospective brides. Nikolai and his general worked alone in his sitting room, a fire crackling in the tiled grate. The chamber still bore his father's stamp, the double eagle wrought in gold. The heavy carpets, the curtains so laden with brocade, they looked as if they could be melted down and pressed into coins. Zoya's list went on and on, girl after girl, a march of milling maidens. The brides are meant to be covered for our meetings with the Kirch and the Zemina, he said. Perhaps we could make this an opening gambit, less an engagement than a prelude to an engagement. Zoya straightened the papers before her. 2 birds with 1 stone, Your Highness. It's a matter of efficiency and expectations. You need a bride, and right now, you're still a worthy prospect. Right now, you're still young. You have all of your teeth, and Ravka's military hasn't yet been trounced into the ground. Your hesitation is distinctly unkingly. It isn't like you. It wasn't. He excelled at decisions. He enjoyed them. It was like clearing the deadfall from a forest so that you could see an open path. But when he thought of choosing a wife, the branches crowded in on him, and he found himself glad to be left alone in the dark. Perhaps not alone precisely. He very much enjoyed the quiet of this room, the warmth of the fire, and the still-spined harpy seated across from him. So I snapped the paper she was holding to get his attention. Princess Eri Kirtaban. Second in line for the Shu throne? Yes, and one of our most ideal prospects. She's young, amiable, and wildly popular among her own people. Very gifted on the Katur. 12 strings or 18? Why does it matter? It's important to have standards, asked Zelensky. Are you so sure the Shu will send her? The invitation will be to the royal family. But given the way the people adore Princess Eri, I suspect her older sister wouldn't be sorry to see her out of the country. If they send one of the younger sisters, she shrugged, Well, no, they aren't serious about an alliance, but a true bride would free us from the need for Kirch gold. And how long do you suppose Ravka would remain independent after such a marriage? The Shu wouldn't need to invade, we'd be hand lettering an invitation. There's no perfect choice, said Zoya. Who's next? She sighed and handed him another dossier. Elk Marie Smith. Nikolai glanced down at the file. She's barely 16. She's from one of the most powerful families in Kirch. Besides, Alina was only a few years older when he threw away the Lance of Emerald in her. And so was I at the time. Thinking of Alina always smarted. He knew he'd been a fool to propose to her, but at the time, he'd been more in need of a friend than a political ally. Or at least it had felt that way. Zoya leaned back and cast him a long look. Don't tell me you're still mourning the loss of our little son's saint. Of course he was. He'd liked Alina. Maybe he'd even started to love her, and maybe some arrogant part of him had simply expected her to say yes. He was a king after all, and a passable dancer, but she'd known the Darkling better than anyone. Maybe she sensed what was festering inside him. Years had passed, and yet her rejection still stung. Never had a gift for pining, Nikolai said, though I do like to show off my profile by staring mournfully out of the windows. Alkmarie Smith's parents will still marry her off, probably to some merchant. I'm sure she'd be better pleased with a king. No. Next, Natasha Beretrova, said Zoya. The Baroness Beretrova? Zoya looked studiously at the paper. That's the one. She's 50. She's a very well-off widow with lands near Karyeva that could prove essential in any southern campaign. No, Zoya. Zoya rolled her eyes but picked up another paper. Linia Apir. No. Oh, for all the saints and their suffering, Nikolai, now you're just being difficult. She's 23 and by all accounts beautiful, even-tempered, has a talent for mathematics. Nikolai flicked a piece of flint from his cuff. I'd expect nothing less of my half-sister. Zoya stilled. She glowed like a painted icon in her kafta, the firelight clinging to her like a halo. He swore no woman had ever looked better in blue. So it's true then? As true as any story, Nikolai said. The rumors of his bastardy had circulated since well before his birth, and he'd done his best to make peace with them. But he'd only ever spoken the truth of his parentage to one person, Alina Starkov. Why was he telling Zoya now? When he told Alina, she'd reassured him, said he would still make a great king. Zoya would offer no such kindness, but still he unlocked the top of his desk and removed the miniature his mother had passed along to him. She'd given it to him before she'd been forced into exile when she told him who his father really was, a Fjerdan shipping magnate who had once served as emissary to the Grand Palace. Saints, Zoya said as she stared down at the portrait. The likeness, striking, I know. Only the eyes were different, tiny dots of blue instead of hazel, and the beard, of course, but looking at the miniature was like gazing into the future. Then Nikolai had grown a bit older, a bit graver, with lines at the corners of his eyes. Zoya hurled into the fire. Zoya! Nikolai shouted, lunging toward the grate. What kind of fool are you? She spat. He reached his hand out, but the flames were too high, and he recoiled, his rage igniting at the sight of the tiny canvas melting in his frame. He whirled on her. You forget yourself. The portrait was as good as the loaded gun pointed at your heart. She jabbed her finger into his chest. Ravka's heart. And you would risk it all for what? Stupid sentiment? He seized her hand before she could jab him again. I am not one of your boys to be trifled with and lectured to. I am your king. Zoya's blue eyes flashed. Her chin lifted as if to say, what is a mortal king to a queen who can summon storms? You are my king, and I wish to you to remain my king, even if you're too daft to protect your claim to the throne. Maybe so, but he didn't want to hear it. You had no right. I am sworn to protect you, to protect this realm. I had every right. She yanked her hand from his. What if Magnus up here came to this palace, or was invited to some banquet with you and Kirch? All it would take is a single glance for people to know they already know, Nikolai said, feeling suddenly weary. Or they've guessed. There have been whispers since before I was born. We should consider eliminating him. He clenched his fists. Zoya, you will do no such thing. I forbid it. And if I find you acted without my consent, you will lose your rank and can spend the rest of your days teaching Grisha children how to make cloud animals. For a moment, it looked like she might lift her ends and start a storm to blow the whole palace down. But then, she bobbed a perfect curtsy that still somehow conveyed her contempt. Of course, Monsieur. Are you really so ruthless, Zoya? He is an innocent man. His only crime was loving my mother. No, his crime was betting your mother. Nikolai shook his head. Leave it to Zoya to cut right to the truth. Of course, he had no way of knowing if there had ever been love between his mother and his true father, but he hoped there had been something more than lust and regret. He plucked his wine glass from his abandoned dinner tray and drank it to the dregs. One day you will overstep, and I will not be so forgiving. On that day you may clap me in irons and throw me in your dungeons. She crossed the room, took the glass from his hands, and set it on the table. But tonight it is you who wears chains. Her voice was almost kind. Nikolai released a sigh. After the business of this evening, it will be a relief. He unlocked his bedchamber. Servants were allowed access to clean only under Toya and Tamar's supervision, and only once a week. He had no personal valet and attended to his own bath. Though it had become his nightly prison, the room itself was a sanctuary. Maybe the only place in the palace that truly felt like it belonged to him. The walls were painted the deep blue of the sea, and the map above the mantel had been taken from the cabin he'd once occupied as Stormhound, when he disguised himself as a privateer and sailed the world's ocean aboard the Volney. A long glass stood propped on a tripod by the bank of windows. He couldn't see much through it, the stars, the houses of the upper town, but even having it there gave him some sense of peace, as if he might one day put his eye to it and see the heaving shoulders of a great grey sea, salt water in the veins. One of his crewmen had told him, "We go mad if we're too long on shore." Nikolai would not go mad, at least not from being landlocked. He had been born to be a king, even if his blood told a different story, and he would see his country to victory again, but first he had to make it through the night. He sat down at the edge of the bed, removed his boots, and clamped the iron fetters around each of his ankles, then lay back. Zoya waited, and he was grateful for it. It was a small thing to be one to chain himself, but it allowed him to keep control for a short time longer. Only when Nikolai had fastened the fetter to his left wrist did she approach. "Ready?" He nodded. In these moments, her ruthlessness made it all a bit more bearable. Zoya would never indulge him, never shame him with pity. She tugged on the special lock that David had rigged. With a sudden clanking whir, 3 chains shot across his body at the knees, midriff, and shoulders. He was strong when the beast came upon him, and they could take no chances. He knew this, should be used to the experience of restraint, and still all he wanted was to struggle. Instead, he kept his easy demeanor and offered up his right wrist to Zoya. "And what are your plans for the evening, darling jailer? Headed to a secret rendezvous? Zoya blew out a disgruntled breath as she bent to fasten the last fetter and check the security of the locks. "As if I have the time." "I know you go somewhere late at night, Zoya," he prodded. He was curious but also eager for distraction. You've been seen on the grounds, though no one seems to know where you go." "I go a lot of places, Your Highness, and if you keep prying into my personal life, I'll have some suggestions as to where you can go. Why keep your dalliance a secret? Is he an embarrassment?" Nikolai flexed his fingers, trying to even his breathing. Zoya turned her head, and the lamplight caught the crescent of her cheekbone, gliding the dark waves of her hair. He never quite managed to make himself immune to her beauty, and he was glad his arms were chained to the bed, or he might have been tempted to reach for her. "Keep still," she snapped. "You're worse than a child given too many cakes." Bless her poisoned tongue. "You could stay, Zoya. Entertain me with lively tales of your childhood. I find your spite very soothing." "Why don't I ask Zoya to soothe you by reciting some poetry? There it is, so sharp, so acerbic. Better than any lullaby." As the last lock clicked home, her sleeve slid back, revealing the silver cuff that circled her wrist, pieces of bone or what might have been teeth fussed with the metal. He had never seen her without it, and wasn't even sure if it could be removed. He knew a bit about amplifiers. He had even helped Alina secure the scales of the Sea Whip, the second of Morozova's legendary amplifiers. But he could admit there was a whole universe he didn't know. "Tell me something, Zelensky. David said transgressing the boundaries of Grisha power has repercussions, but doesn't an amplifier do just that? Is Param any different?" Zoya brushed her fingers over the metal, her face thoughtful. "I'm not sure Param is so different from Merzost. Like Merzost, the drug requires a terrible sacrifice for the power it grants, a Grisha's will, even her life. But amplifiers are something else. They're rare creatures, tied to the making at the heart of the world, the source of all creation. When an amplifier gives up its life, that is the sacrifice the universe requires. The bond is forever forged with the Grisha who deals with the killing blow. It's a terrible thing, but beautiful as well. Merzost is abomination. I know. It's a good thing I have such a fondness for myself. All Grisha feel the pull toward Merzost, the hunger to see just what we might do if we had no limits. Even you? A small smile touched Zoya's lips, especially me. Power is protection. Before Nikolai could ask what she meant, she added, but the price for that particular kind of power is too high. When the Darkling tried to create his own amplifiers, the result was the fold. She held up her arm, the cuff glinting into the lamplight. This is enough for me. The shark teeth worn by the twins, mused Nikolai. Kenya's kestrel bones. I've heard the stories behind all of them, but you've never told me the tale of the amplifier you wear. Zoya raised a brow. In the space of a breath, the contemplative girl was gone and the distant general had returned. Steel is earned, Your Highness, so are stories, she rose, and I believe you're stalling. He found me out. He was sorry to see her leave. Whatever guise she wore. Good night, Commander. Good night, King Wretch. He would not beg Zoya to stay. It was not in his nature to plead with anyone, and that was not the pact they shared. They did look to each other for comfort. They kept each other marching. They kept each other strong, so he would not find another excuse to get her talking again. He would not tell her he was afraid to be left alone with the thing he might become, and he would not ask her to leave the lamp burning. A child's bit of magic to ward off the dark, but he was relieved when she did it anyway. They're so cute.